Hi everybody, and I'm back again after a long break here to make another tutorial video about Empire at War modding. I've had some requests in my absence to make a video on how to use the Empire at War particle editor, so that's what we're going to go over today. Let's get into how this tool works and how you can use it to make particles for Empire at War. So when you open the particle editor and you're not opening an existing particle, this is what it looks like. You have one emitter up here in the top left of this white space here is your list of emitters. So you'll start with one emitter up here that's just called default. We can change the name to example. And then over here in our viewport, if we hold shift, that brings our particle up. We can drag it around, and then if we click while holding shift, we can place that particle anywhere that we like. Left clicking in the viewport pans the camera around, right clicking rotates it, and then your mouse wheel zooms. For now, I'm going to turn off terrain. That's this kind of patch looking button up here, so I'll turn terrain off, and I'm actually going to change the background color to black. I don't know why they picked blue as the default background color, but we'll just change it to black. It allows us to see the colors of our particle more clearly. So the default particle emitter is the Empire at War's cloud texture applied to one particle that appears on a continuous stream every second. If we want to adjust that, we can change this to, let's say, 100 particles per second. And because particles, by default, when you open the editor, they use the additive render mode. They're adding on top of each other until eventually we just get this kind of white blob. But if we click shift and move our mouse around, now we can see that that particle that was just popping as the mouse moved now has kind of a trail because we have more particles emitting per second. Something to keep in mind is that, if we increase this to 1,000 particles per second, our trail gets a lot denser. But in Empire at War, if you have a fast-moving particle like a smoke trail on a missile, it's going to get dotty like this no matter how many particles per second you have. I assume that that's just a limitation with how particles are rendered in the game engine, but just be aware, upping this particle count does not solve that kind of spotty problem. It's not going to make a smoother trail. All this does when you get up to this many particles per second is just impact your performance negatively. So in general, something like a missile trail or whatever, just keep it around 100 and that's fine. We have some tricks that we can use to reduce that spottiness and make it seem more natural. So let's just assume we're making a smoke trail for our missile projectile, just as an example here. So we'll keep this at 100 particles per second, and we'll keep the lifetime at 100, and then we'll change the minimum lifetime here. What this does is it means that for every one of these particles that's emitted, it is right now required to live for 100% of that 1 second. So every little smoke blob there is going to live for exactly 1 second. If I reduce this to, let's say, 50, now every one of these smoke blobs has to live for at least half a second, but randomly it can live more than that up to 1 second. So we'll see some of those smoke blobs start to fade out sooner than others now. If we wanted to make an explosion, we could do burst. This is If you have your bursts set to 0, then that means it will loop the burst infinitely every maximum lifetime duration, which is for us is 1 second. Burst delay, we can, if we increase this to 2, you see our bursts are going slower now. Particles per burst, that's pretty self-explanatory. 48, now we've got more particles appearing in every burst. Obviously, for something like an explosion, we don't want it to loop forever. In general, we just set it to 1 burst, and then it's done. That's how that works. Weather particles, basically what this does is it attaches your particle to the camera. So for things like rain and snow, they're actually not emitting across the entire map. They're just emitting a certain distance from the camera. They follow that around as your camera moves around the map to create the illusion that it's snowing or raining everywhere, but it's not actually. That's just a trick that they use to help save on performance so that you don't have like a million raindrops or a million snowflakes all falling at once, which would be really taxing on your GPU. This bottom section here, link particle to instance, you'll never use that, so we'll just skip over it. Emit mode, this you will use sometimes. Random vertex, random mesh, every vertex. What this means is that if you have a custom model in 3ds Max and you want your particle to interact with that model somehow, you'll pick one of these to change how that particle interacts with that model. In 3ds Max, you'll take your particle proxy and you'll use the link tool to link it to that mesh, and then here we can choose random vertex or random mesh, or every vertex. That means that every time this particle appears, it will appear randomly all over the mesh, randomly at each of the vertices on the mesh, or that one particle will appear on every vertex of the mesh simultaneously. This is used for things like when your ship gets hit by an ion cannon, that lightning effect that appears when it's been ion stunned. That is a random mesh assignment to make those lightning bolts appear at random spots across the hull of your ship. So this doesn't get used terribly often, but it is helpful when you're making special particles for specific instances for ion cannons or whatever. So let's go back to making our missile trail. We'll change it back to continuous stream 100, 1 second lifespan, 50% minimum lifetime. Okay, obviously that is not what we want for our missile trail. So next we're going to go to the Appearance tab. We can add random colors if we want to, or random alpha generation. We don't really want that, but just to kind of show you what it does. Here, let me spread these out a little bit so you can see what's going on. If we add a little bit of a value to each of these here, now we've got this kind of rainbow effect. If we add random alpha and change this from additive to transparent, now we can see that these have random alpha values too. Alpha is just essentially another word for transparency. The greater the alpha value, the less transparent it will be, and vice versa. Change this back to additive real quick. And put these to 0 because we don't want rainbow missiles. Next, tail. What this does is it takes like per pixel of your texture here and stretches it out if you're by a certain length as it moves. Whoops, wrong one. Let's shorten our tail here so we can actually see what's going on and not give ourselves a seizure. So that's what that is. It's useful if you have things like sparks or comets or something like that. That tail can create a really cool effect for those types of things. Again, don't use it super often. It's not, in my opinion, the greatest feature of the particle editor, but for little things like that, you know, if you have a tail length of like 10 and you size your particle to be 1 pixel or whatever, you know, it can create kind of a cool little sparking effect. Rotation directions. If we choose fixed, we can set the amount of degrees, so every time that this particle appears, it will be rotated a random direction somewhere between the two values that we've set here. So in this case, we give it a full range of rotation, 360 degrees. And it will pick randomly somewhere in there to rotate this image, you know, just to give it a little bit more realistic of an appearance. Random rotation direction corresponds with this rotation speed. So if we set our rotation speed to anything, this random rotation direction would allow it to rotate left or right randomly at the speed that we set here. If you have fixed random rotation checked, it will not allow you to set a speed for it. So we'll turn this on. We can see that they're all rotating left. So now if we pick random, now we can see that it's rotating either direction randomly. Rendering always face camera. This means that no matter how I rotate the camera, that particle texture will always be flat on to my angle of view. If I uncheck that, we can see that that changes. Particles will always default to top down, and there's no way to change that in this tool. So if you don't want something that's top down, you have to have it set to face camera, which is unfortunate that we're limited to that, but that's how this tool works. So we'll change that back. Heat particle. What this does is this changes the rendering type from additive or transparent to the heat rendering, which causes like a visible distortion, like a heat wave or like a ripple on water or something like that. Gives it kind of a glassy effect. This can be useful for, you know, if you're trying to make the illusion of like a sound wave that blasts out from your explosion or something like that. Or if you're trying to make a water ripple. In my mod, I use them for like walker footprints when they're walking through water. I have a ring that uses this distortion effect that goes out to simulate kind of a ripple. No depth test. What that does, we can see that these particles here will intersect with the ground, and the particles that are appearing below the ground we can't see. If we check no depth test, that means that it no longer intersects with the ground. It ignores the ground, and we will always see the whole particle at all times. Blend mode. Additive means that for every one of these little sprites that's on top of each other, it will get more and more white. It's like adding layers of light onto each other, and it gets brighter and brighter and denser and denser. Transparent just renders the sprites as they are. See, they don't add to each other. We don't get more brightness the more that they're layered. It just uses the alpha channel of the texture to create like a hole punch and just render the sprite with transparency, which corresponds with the alpha tab here. See, now we can fade it in and out over time, or if we kept these bars even, it would just be an even fade for the whole duration of the particle. For smoke, obviously we want smoke to fade out over time, so we'll set the end to 0 and the beginning to something like 0.8. And we'll keep it on transparent. Inverse is transparent, but the opposite. In this case, it doesn't do anything. It does that with certain texture types. These depth ones here are very special instances, and diffuse transparent. Most of these render modes you're just not going to use. The two that you'll use almost exclusively are additive and transparent. Now if we go to our physics tab, this is where we can change what our particle is actually doing when it emits. Turn ground back off. So initial position, that's pretty self-explanatory. You can do an x, y, or z value, z being up, x and y being to, forward, back, left, or right. Or we can do random box, cube, sphere, and cylinder. In the case of a smoke trail, the best approach is to do random sphere and set it to something small. Constrained to surface, what this does is it makes it so your particles have to emit on the surface of the sphere. We uncheck that box, now they can emit anywhere within the volume of that sphere. We'll go ahead and set this to something like 5. And then initial speed, also set to random sphere. Just change that to a very small amount. We don't want our smoke going crazy. We still want it to act like a smoke trail, but we do want it to kind of drift away from the center just slightly. Inward speed causes the particles to sort of collapse back on themselves, or to be flung out if we have a negative value. Just leave that at 0 for now. Parent speed inherit. What this does is if your particle is linked to an object in the game, you can tell it what percentage of speed you want to inherit from that linked object. So since this is a missile trail that we're using, it will be linked to that missile projectile. Do we want it to inherit speed from that? We don't, because the smoke from behind a missile doesn't follow it in a blob like this. So we actually want this value to be 0 so that it acts like a trail. Affected by wind. This is good if you have like stationary smoke from smoldering wreckage or something like that. For missile trails, we don't really have to use it, but when you're in the map editor, you can actually adjust the speed of that map's wind settings, and that interacts with this checkbox. The faster the wind on your map, the more that these particles will sort of be blown around by it. I'm going to leave it off for this because we don't need it. Acceleration. This means acceleration always starts at 0, but it will gradually speed the particle up along one of these axes over time, units seconds squared. Gravity acceleration does the same thing, but down or up if we have a negative value. This is, for example, if this smoke was, again, from that smoldering wreckage, this would be great for that, to have your smoke or fire or something like that coming up in a more natural way. Inward acceleration is the same thing as this inward speed. The only difference is that inward speed is constant. If I were to set this to 5, that means that my particles are going to speed inward at a speed of 5 units per second from the minute they are born till the minute they die. This just uses a different equation for that inward acceleration, units times seconds squared. So it will gradually speed up greater than this value that I initially set, whereas this is constant. Object space acceleration, probably will never use it, so we'll just ignore that one. Ground interaction. So if we turn ground back on, and let's set our emit mode to exact and place it above the ground. Now we'll turn our turn this up, turn our gravity acceleration up so that our particles are falling. Let's give it just a little bit more life too for the sake of this example. So now our particles are falling through the ground, but if we change our ground interaction, we can change it to disappear. So now these particles will despawn as soon as they hit the ground rather than falling through it. This is good if you have a complex particle that you want to save some performance. We have bounce. Now we can see these particles bouncing when they hit the ground. This is good for sparks or rubble, things from explosions that you want to interact with the ground. You can change the bounciness so that they go crazy when they hit. Obviously, just a little value change goes a long way. Just a fair warning too that this bounce behavior can be kind of unstable. If you have a lot of particles emitting per second and you turn bounce on, you're going to crash the editor and potentially corrupt your particle file. So just be careful with bounce. The other one is stick. This can be used for if you have, like, I don't know, slime coming out of a pipe or something like that. You want that slime to kind of creep along the ground a little bit before it disappears. That would be where you might use the stick behavior. For our smoke trail, we don't need ground behavior, obviously, so we'll turn that back off. We'll reset our gravity to 0. We'll put this back to something small. Let's try 10. I think I liked 5 better. And then we'll put this back to 100. And that back to 1. Okay, so that goes over the 3 different tabs here and all of the features within them. Now we need to look at the tabs that are above our timeline. Red, green, and blue, pretty self-explanatory. These just allow us to change the colors. We can link colors together so that their values change simultaneously, or we can keep them unlinked so that when we edit the values, we change the color of our particle. Pretty simple. Alpha, we went over that earlier, but we'll show it again. We can link it to a color if we like, or we can leave it independent and just change the transparency of our object to suit our liking. Scale also is pretty self-explanatory. This changes the scale of your sprite over time. Smoke, we actually want to get bigger over time, so we will set this to 10 to start with and set this to something like 30. So now our smoke will get bigger over time. Index. This changes what texture your particle is using if the texture that it is using is a complex texture like the particle master. If you open this texture up, it actually is a lot of textures that are laid out in a grid pattern in one file. Each of those texture elements are 64 pixels squared. So if we change the index, that means that it's going to the next 64 by 64 tile of that grid and displaying the texture from that tile. If you're using a custom texture that is just one texture, it's not a grid thing or anything like that, this would just be the resolution of that texture. So 64, 128, 256, 512, whatever resolution that texture is, that would be that. Minimum scale, this is kind of like the minimum lifetime, where we say we want it to at least last 50% of our maximum lifetime, but somewhere randomly between that 50% and 100% it can choose to die. The minimum scale thing here is that same thing. So our scale goes from 10 to 20, and we want it to be somewhere in between that. We'll set it to 0, so it can be anything from whatever our scales are here to 0 randomly. It will generate that, which works pretty well for smoke and other natural effects that way, just because there's a lot of randomness in nature. So obviously, going back to index, we want our smoke texture here, so we'll just leave the index at 0. Rotation speed we've already talked about. We are currently, even though this is set to 1, we've rechecked our fixed random rotation, so this is still actually disabled, but we want it that way for our smoke anyways. I'm actually going to change this to 2 and lower that just a tad. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Now let's say that we want to have a fire at the beginning of this smoke trail that sort of burns out and turns into smoke. So we want to create an effect that starts off kind of this red-orange color and then slowly fades back to gray or black. So let's unlink all of our colors for starters. We're going to get rid of blue completely. We'll put it at 50 actually, because we will want that gray later. Let's start with some red. So we'll use the insert key. We'll put it at about 10. Now we can manipulate everything before that key or everything after that key independently from the stuff around it. And we can set, as many keys as we want, or select and delete keys if we have too many. We can change the way that keys are interpolated. Right now we have linear, which is just straight lines between keys. We can change it to curves, which are a little bit more graceful. Or we can change it to stair step, which is a hard cutoff. It will be this key for this many seconds, then immediately switch to this key. We don't want that. We kind of want something gradual here. We can play with the colors, obviously, but now you can see we've got this thing that sort of goes from red back to, it's kind of a gray red. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. And you can adjust the timing on these so that that yellow sort of orangey color fades out faster or lasts longer. It's whatever you want, but you just set keys down here and play with that timing to get what you need. The last couple things we'll talk about, if we have a particle effect that we like, but let's say we get it in game, we find out that it's too big or it lasts too long, we can change the global values of the entire particle by coming to Edit, Rescale Particle System, And we can change the percentage of the duration of that particle's lifetime or its size with these editors here. So if we just set this to 50, click OK, rescaled the entire particle system, reduced it by 50%. And it will apply the same reduction to its lifespan as well using the other value. Now let's say that we have this particle here, but we want to have some kind of a light or something at the beginning of it. Let's add a new emitter. We'll change its index to a more appropriate texture. There we go. Increase the scale so we can actually see it. Give it a few more particles per second. Random rotation, or fixed. Here, change those. And then we'll put our parent speed to inherit 100%. It's not perfect, but if you wanted like a little fire on your missile trail, you could do something like that. So that the second emitter is always following right behind the missile itself while the smoke trails off.
Thank you for watching today's tutorial video. If you have questions about the video or suggestions for future topics, be sure to leave a comment down below. Also, if you'd like to support this channel and the work that I'm doing, feel free to donate to the PayPal link provided in the description below. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.